I'm joined today by economist Richard Wolff, professor emeritus of economics at the University of Massachusetts, visiting professor at the New School University in New York City. Professor Wolff, it's so great to have you on, and we have now a very interesting situation with the candidacy of Bernie Sanders for president of the United States, where we're hearing so much in terms of the term socialism being thrown about. And there's sort of two different elements that I want to unpack with you here today. The first being, is the term socialist really appropriate when we analyze the policy positions of Bernie Sanders? And number two, the idea that many of the ideas that may fall under the umbrella of socialistic are increasingly popular in the United States. Let's start with the first issue. When you do an analysis of Bernie Sanders' positions, is there a general label of socialist that could be accurately applied?
Well, the answer to that question requires a few minutes. I'll be brief, I promise, about what socialism is.
Right.
The problem is that, like its ego, its other, if you like, capitalism, it is defined in different ways by different people at different times. So you just have to understand that the word socialism isn't some narrowly defined thing that everybody knows the meaning of and everybody has a pretty much similar definition. That's simply not the case. So to give you an example, by some definitions of socialism that had been embraced by many, yes, Bernie Sanders has a long socialist tradition. He is very skeptical, for example, of the behavior of private capitalist corporations. He insists that they are mostly driven by profits, something many of them admit anyway, and that in the course of pursuing maximum profits, they shortchange the environment, they shortchange the quality of life for their employees, and so on and so on and so on. And that when he totals up the costs of what capitalism doesn't take account of and weighs it against the benefits and notices that the benefits accrue chiefly to a relatively small part of the population and the costs to the majority, he ends up being a critic of capitalism and advocates for a change to what he calls socialism. And yes, that's something many people who have been called socialists have done. And by that standard, that's what he's in favor of.
Now, at the same time, if we consider the element of socialism which advocates for a sort of community or public ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange, that could not be further from what Bernie Sanders is talking about.
That's right. He's in favor of one kind of socialism. By the way, it sometimes has adjectives like democratic socialism or social democracy and a variety of other such labels. Precisely these labels intended to distinguish it from other definitions of socialism, such as the one you've pointed to, where, and let me be blunt here, some notions of socialism basically say capitalism is about private ownership of the means of production, whereas socialism has the state doing that. So instead of there being private companies running the stores and the offices and the factories, it's instead government that does all that thing. And the second part of that older definition says that instead of letting the market determine who gets what, the government uses a plan to distribute resources and products in the way that planners think is appropriate. So another definition of socialism that Bernie Sanders clearly does not agree with is focused on government ownership instead of private and government planning instead of markets. And that would be the kind of socialism associated with the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, Cuba, at least until recently. Cuba's changing and so on. But yes, so you have one kind of socialism that fits Bernie Sanders and another kind that does not.
Let's talk now a little bit about the palatability of some of the specific ideas that Bernie Sanders supports. I wrote a blog for Huffington Post about a month and a half ago where I pointed out that on many issues, Bernie Sanders, while framed as a sort of far left extremist, actually represents the predominant view amongst Americans. So examples of this include, does the government have some basic duty to provide some level of health care to everybody, regardless of ability to pay? Bernie Sanders believes the answer is yes. Around 2/3 of Americans, when asked fairly, not when they say, should the government take over healthcare, but when they're asked fairly, agree with that. On questions of, should higher taxes be used on the very rich to reduce the income gap? That is a very positively polling question in general in the United States. Bernie Sanders agrees with that. And there are other examples. Do you find this to be a change recently in American society? Or do you think that Americans have just never really been asked very clearly about these ideas?
I guess my answer is neither of those. Let me tell you why I think. I think that many of the socialist ideas of the sort that Bernie Sanders is advocating have in fact been popular majority perspectives in the United States for most of its history. And that means the 19th century as well as the 20th century, as well as into our times. I don't think those perspectives were ever dismissed by the American people or that they turned against them. I think something very different happened. When the socialist movements in the United States got strong at the end of the 19th century, again in the 1930s, again in the 1960s, and now again, showing that it's a recurring phenomena, it sometimes got strong enough that you had a kind of reaction, a blowback, a notion on the part of the business community and people who like capitalism that they were indeed now threatened. And in response, they produced, quite effectively, by the way, programs to demonize socialism, to associate it with scary things, so that people would focus on another definition of socialism that they could be easily driven to not like, and kind of throw out the baby with the bathwater, forget or lose sight of all of those other parts of socialism and those other definitions that in fact had been very compatible. And by the way, this was always done in the same way. You were told that socialism was against religion. So if you believed in God, then socialism was your enemy. Or you were told that socialism was something coming from the outside, a foreign idea, so that if you were interested or supportive of it, you were in some sense disloyal or treasonous. Or you were told that it was all about violence. And if you didn't believe in violence, well, then you shouldn't be a socialist. These are classic scare tactics. We see them on display in our presidential campaigns as the candidates smear each other in every way they can think of. But here you had a concerted effort to demonize socialism, to define it in a way that made demonization easy. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990, there has been no big enemy to sustain the idea that socialism has to do with somebody foreign in Russia or China who threatens you. And since capitalism itself has functioned so poorly in the last 20 years, creating such a divide between rich and poor, basically what you saw was the atrophy of the demonization of socialism and the rise of problems in capitalism that were bound sooner or later to take people back to all those socialist arguments, such as Bernie Sanders is making, that have been majority perspectives through most of this country's history.
Do you think that Occupy Wall Street, for all of the things that it did not do so well, did a very good job of bringing the topic of income inequality back to the forefront and sort of created an atmosphere where you could have more discussions about the failings of the status quo capitalist system?
Absolutely. I mean, if I were advising Bernie Sanders, I am not, but if I were advising Bernie Sanders, I would tell him that at some point he kind of owes it to the history of the United States to take his hat off and thank Occupy Wall Street, because it literally paved the way for what he is not now doing. They didn't know that, and he's not the fellow who has to answer to all of these things. But it is the case because that was the first movement since the Cold War to be able to openly say, look, we're good Americans. We want the best for our country. And we think the inequality between rich and poor is the biggest threat to what the United States could and should be. And unlike others who, if they said anything about it in the 50s or the 60s or the 70s or the 80s or the 90s, would get tarred with the brush. You're a communist, you love the Soviet Union, or go back to Russia, or all the silly things that were said. The Occupy Wall Street was the first one in almost half a century to say, no, we're not going to be shut up by that. We're going to speak what we think is a truth, the 1% versus the 99%. That changed the discourse. I mean, President Obama had to use that in his speeches only after Occupy Wall Street. He never did that before. And I think that changed the whole discussion and the culture of the United States, and absolutely helps explain why Bernie Sanders is drawing the interest he is, the huge audiences he is, and so on.
All right, we've been speaking with economist Richard Wolff, professor emeritus at the University of Massachusetts. Thanks as always.
Thank you, David, and good luck. And I hope to talk with you again in the future.